Hello, friends. So this is the last video lecture on the topic of early adulthood or emerging adulthood. One thing I haven't mentioned is sometimes this time of life is referred to as adult essence, right? It's that cross between adult and adolescent, put them together, especially for people who may be like 20 years old and still living at home in their parents' basement. So they're like living a lifestyle of an adolescent, but they're actually an adult. My adult son would probably fall into that category. He is 28 years old. Now he's on the autism spectrum, so it doesn't completely apply, but he's 28 years old and he lives in our basement and he spends most of his money on his collectibles and his video game system. Now, in all fairness, he'd really like to have a partner. And so, when you think about mate selection and we think about what we've already talked about previously about how your life satisfaction is influenced by if you're doing things, on time. Some of his peers are already married or already pair bonded, and he would like to be pair bonded. And if he gets to like 35 and he still isn't pair bonded, it might affect his well-being. But right now he seems to be in a pretty okay place. Okay, so let's get back to mate selection, because that's what the big Erikson crisis is supposed to be about. In the previous lecture, I was talking about different kinds of love, blah, blah, blah. There's a couple activities for you to follow on that. So mate selection. Evolutionary psychology suggests that men and women are looking for different qualities in a mate. So from the evolutionary psychological perspective, mate selection, or our whole purpose of existence is to reproduce our genes and pass them into the next generation. So therefore, because of men and women's relationship to reproduction, we are looking for different qualities in a mate. A man is looking for a woman who looks healthy and fertile, that she can make a nice, strong, healthy baby. So he will find characteristics of youth and fertility and vitality, curviness. He'll find that attractive. So for him, the signs of what he needs in a mate to pass his genes on are good looks, right? Our physical attractiveness. Women, on the other hand, they're looking for slightly different characteristics. They need, again, this is from an evolutionary model. Women need someone to help them take care of their offspring once their child is born. So attractiveness is moderately important, but it's not as important as a man who has status, because a man who has status will have the resources to help her take care of her offspring. Status and commitment. So she is willing to trade attractiveness, physical appeal, for status or commitment. If it's one or the other, right? Of course, status is important, but she will also take commitment over attractiveness. And again, the whole point is that this is what's necessary for her to take or to pass her genetic material into the next generation. And of course, homogamy. So homogamy refers to the tendency for like to marry like. So the tendency for people of the same racial or ethnic background, of similar age, of similar attractiveness to marry each other. And as much as we might say love is blind, that's really not what the data says. I mean, that's a neat idea, but the data tells us is that that's not really true. And part of that may speak to a phenomenon called marriage market. And your marriage market refers to the people around you that you could potentially access as a marriage partner. Now, things like, what's that thing called? Those mating apps, right? Dating apps. They've all made our mating market much larger. But nevertheless, they're sort of, even they're all about homogamy, right? If you look at people's profiles, the people that they're looking for are similar to themselves. The marriage gradient is a concept that refers to the relationship between the relative status of men and women. And on balance, higher status men, meaning men who have more resources or maybe more attractive, will marry lower status women, or lower status women will marry higher status men. It's not terribly common for women of a higher social status or economic status to marry a lower status man. And again, this sort of supports the idea of evolutionary psychology, right? That a woman needs a man who has more resources than herself to help her take care of her children. The irony of this of this marriage gradient, right? And it can refer to like older people, more attractive, larger, this kind of thing. But the irony of this is that for what this means is that higher status women have fewer options, because it's harder for a higher status woman to find a man who is even of higher status than her for her to marry. And the same thing can be said for lower status men. If the marriage, when the marriage gradient holds true, then that means lower status men, there are fewer options for a low status man to find a woman who has even lower status than himself, right? So that, you know, the cream of the crop, or what do we call it, the cream of the crop or the bottom of the barrel kind of men. And then we also see some ethnic and racial. The question here is marriage for white people. That's a title of a book that I have, and it effectively says that yes, white people are more likely to marry, and part of this has to do with this marriage gradient phenomenon. That for a Black woman, especially a Black woman of high status, because so many Black men are denied access to the labor force, it's harder for a Black woman to find a higher status man than herself. So they say, yes, marriage is for white people. Not that it's supposed to be, but married people are more likely to be married. White people are more likely to be married. Okay. Attachment style, way back in chapter 1 or chapter 2, where we were talking about, maybe it was chapter 4, where I asked you to describe what it looks like, what attachment looks like in children. And the key there is securely attached children will be calmed when their parent returns. An insecurely attached child will not be calmed, right? And I said this is important because our ability to attach as children influences our ability to attach later on in life. So when people are diagnosed or called or said to have attachment disorder, the significance of attachment disorder for adulthood is if you don't learn the skill to attach and to trust in childhood, it will be very difficult for you to learn to attach and trust in adulthood, right? So our mate selection and our pair bonding is influenced by the parenting that we had as a child. Going back to, remember, because Erickson talked about how those crises were all interconnected. The crisis of trust in infancy then will inform and influence the crisis of intimacy versus isolation in young adulthood. Right? How it's all connected. I think that's the cool part. Okay, a little bit about marriage here. Once upon a time, I used to say that cohabitation predicted divorce because once upon a time it did. Once upon a time, not very long ago in the 80s, people who cohabitated were more likely to get divorced than people who didn't, and that's no longer the case. Marriage and the sequence of relationships has shifted such that cohabitation is a very common sort of step. Even you date, you cohabitate, you get engaged, and you get married. So it doesn't really predict divorce anymore. Interesting thing about marriage, age at marriage, I just looked this up. The last time I'd recorded this video, which was only 2 years ago, the age at first marriage has gone up even further. We are marrying later and later in life. And some theorists say that this is what explains that we have fewer divorces. We don't now. You probably have heard that statistic, 50% of marriages end in divorce. And that was certainly true in the 80s, right? That it didn't mean you had a 50% chance of divorce, but what it meant was in any given time, in any given state, there might be 100 marriage licenses applied, but there may also be 50 divorce petitions. And that's also variable from place to place. For instance, there are fewer divorces in Riley County, Manhattan, where I live, than there are marriages. Well, that's partly because we have a university and we have a military post. Lots of people are getting married, but they're getting divorced in other places. Divorce is very difficult to measure. It has, though, the rate of divorce has gradually declined since the 1980s, since when it peaked. If you do a quick Google search, you'll find that the average marriage is said to be about 8.2 years. But this is not really a very fair measure because it takes short marriages, 1-year marriages, and it also accounts for long marriages. A statistic that I have been using for a while now is the median duration, which means half of marriages last more. So the median duration of a first marriage, last I could find the statistic, was 12 years. So what that said is half of marriages have ended, first marriages have ended by 12 years. Half of them are longer than 12 years. But that's only for first marriages. Second and third marriages are more likely to end in divorce than first marriages are, despite sort of the pop culture assumption. But anyway, back to age at first marriage. Today, the statistic is in 2020, age at first marriage is about 27 for women and 29 for men. This is the highest in recorded American history. So some argue that that's why there are fewer divorces. Marital satisfaction, the short of it is on balance, men are more satisfied in marriages than are women. Marital satisfaction goes up and down during stages of the life course. When babies come along, marital satisfaction goes down and may get a little bit better when they're school age, but they get to teenagers, marital satisfaction goes down again. So it's babies. It's not on this slide, but I had somewhere on one of my slides, will the real ball and chain please stand up? And what that refers to is that it's actually kids. So when kids come along, couples are less likely to divorce, but they're also less happy, they're less satisfied. If you stay married up until your kids leave home, until you're empty nester, marital satisfaction begins to go back up. But kids reduce the chances of divorce, but diminish the odds reduce the odds of satisfaction. And this will be our last slide. There's just some general statistics here about most people have kids. Oh, there it is right there. Moms and dads' involvement. Once upon a time, children were thought of as an asset. You had lots of children because you needed to support yourself. Now it kind of is the other way around. Now kids are like consumers of our attention and our money. Once upon a time, they generated our wealth. So we give, so they go from being like an asset to a liability. Kids are very expensive. That's often the logic why we only have one. Used to be you had to have a bunch because you needed them to work the farm. The effect on gender roles, on marital gender roles, couples who say before kids come along, we are going to have equitable gender roles, the babies come along, and sure enough, it's a pretty traditional one, mama doing the caregiving, mama doing the meal preparation, and dad not. This also leads to some unsatisfactory marital satisfaction. And then this one, effect on parental satisfaction, the effect on, but this basically what this point is about is that traditional model that moms do all the caregiving and dad takes care of the discipline and all of this, it's not satisfying to mom or to dad. Fathers report being more satisfied when they're more engaged in their child's life. Sometimes mom will act as a gatekeeper and she'll sort of say, she'll sort of correct dad when he does everything or make fun of him when he makes dinner for the kids. And this can make couples unhappy. This can make people unsatisfied. Or when we hold dad responsible for all the discipline, right? We say, oh, wait for your dad to get home. And he always has to be like the bad guy. My husband said to me one time, why are you always making me out to be the asshole? But the point being is that these traditional gender roles are not necessarily satisfactory. Marital satisfaction, we talked about babies, the effect of divorce, prevention. What does it say? I don't remember why, I'm not sure why that's italicized there. Fondness for each other, remain aware of life events. Basically, keep communicating with each other. And two-earner households, we call that the second shift. And that continues to be documented, that when both women and men work outside the home for wages, because here's the thing, is they always work. The difference is, do they work outside the home for wages? There's always an additional, what's called the second shift. And that's the work that happens after you come home, right? To make the meals, do the laundry, get the kids ready for bed. And it remains that still women are doing the bulk of that second shift. Men have picked up more, certainly in my professional life, men do more, but it still is not an even split. And so this is one of the explanations for marital dissatisfaction and why marital dissatisfaction is higher for women than it is for men. And that, my friends, wraps up the chapter on early adulthood. The next chapter will be middle adulthood. Thank you for listening.